I'd also now like to introduce Lesley Hughes. So Lesley is a distinguished professor of biology and Pro-Vice Chancellor in Research Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. She's an ecologist whose main research interest has been the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems and the implications of climate change for conservation. She's a former lead author on the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report, a former federal Climate Commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. She's also a director for WWF Australia and a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. Also, just before I go on with Lesley, thanks so much for putting your details in the chat, especially just working out who's who. It's really nice to see vets from all over Australia, all different parts of the profession. And there's been some really interesting comments too in there, which I encourage you to read. Lesley, thanks so much for joining us today. And just by way of introduction, I believe you've had a bit of a long-standing feud with a brush turkey in recent times. And it sounds like you came off second best. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I did come off second best, Liz. Yes, Liz, just for those of you that are interested in this, Liz asked both Mark and I to supply her with a fun fact about our lives. And so I gave her a few details of my zoological background, but my major failure has been a lack of success in stopping a male brush turkey destroying my garden when it decided to build a mound on my vegetable garden. I have written an article about this for the Sun Herald, and Liz can share that link with you. But I think the moral of the story was it doesn't matter how much larger your brain is than sometimes our feathered friends. Sometimes they win through dint of persistence. And that's what we all have to do, win this climate battle through dint of persistence also. Shall I start, Liz?
Yes, please, if you can share your screen and then we'll see how we go.
Okay, can everybody see the full screen, or are you seeing just a part screen?
We're seeing the next slide as well as the current.
We don't want to do that.
Change that, yeah.
Yeah, let me just go back to the previous.
And by way of introduction, I will say, as we've explained, 18 of our former CVOs put together a letter to the Prime Minister outlining their concern about the impact of climate change on animals specifically. So Lesley's going to go through the response that the PM sent back, and that was probably about 6 weeks ago, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yep. Thanks, Liz. I'm going to have to sort of just share you this view. Zoom doesn't cope with the full screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try to sort the facts from the spin in the letter that you received back by breaking it down and focusing on the major statements. I'll move through fairly quickly to hopefully leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So here's the letter that you got back. It's a fairly stock standard letter that I think is probably sent to any individual or group that protests about the lack of climate action at the federal level. So let's have a look at some of the statements in that letter. The very first statement is that Australia is taking strong climate action as part of a coordinated global effort. Let's look at some of the facts. There's various international groups that monitor international action of climate change. The Climate Performance Index, for example, last year rated Australia down there in the red zone as number 56 out of 61 countries. If we look at the map associated with that analysis, we can see that Australia was listed as one of the worst performers for climate change policy and action globally. More recently, the UN put out their Sustainable Development Goals report and actually listed Australia as number 176 out of 177 countries on the basis of climate action. We only just beat Brunei. Various commentators have also contributed. So I've put lots of links in these slides so you can get more information. Next statement, we have overachieved on our Kyoto era targets and are on track to overachieve on our 2030 target. Let's have a look at the facts. Well, in fact, we have not overachieved on any of those targets. We are below, we are not going to meet the Kyoto target, except possibly due to the COVID situation. We are on target to just miss the Kyoto target in terms of emissions. Importantly, however, we should recognise that the Kyoto targets that Australia managed to negotiate were very, very weak. For Kyoto 1, it was regarded as the second weakest in the world and the weakest in the world for the Kyoto 2 target. The government also has talked about using carryover credits from the Kyoto Protocol to meet its Paris targets, which has been heavily criticised. The best analogy I've heard from somebody is that this is like taking your marks for a kindergarten colouring in competition and using them, the excess marks, to try to pass your university exams. That's how, frankly, ridiculous and I think indefensible that is. If we have a look at Australia's Paris target, which is for a 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, we are also not on track to meet that target. So our emissions are shown there in the green line. The dotted line shows where we need to be to meet our own Paris target. Another statement in the letter is that the Paris target is a responsible one that makes a significant contribution to global climate action. In fact, Australia's Paris target has been judged by the Climate Tracker organisation as being insufficient. That is, that if other countries adopted Australia's target, we would reach 3 degrees of warming, as Mark indicated in his earlier slides. Okay, another statement. At the centre of our policies is the $3.5 billion climate solutions package, including the new $2 billion climate solutions fund. This builds on our previous $2.55 billion emissions reduction fund. I just want to focus on the $2.55 billion emissions reduction fund. It is the case that this money was spent. The really critical question is, however, did it actually do any good? So let me show you a graph from the Australia Institute. This shows Australian emissions from 2004 until mid-2012, when the carbon price was introduced by the Gillard government. When the carbon price was introduced, it was an immediate and very effective price signal. It immediately led to a reduction in emissions, especially from the electricity sector. When the carbon price was abolished by the Abbott government in this emissions reduction fund, spending $2.55 billion of our taxpayers' money was implemented, you can see that it had no impact whatsoever on emissions reduction. Rather, as soon as we lost the carbon price, emissions started going up, and they have been going up ever since. Another thing that the government snuck in at the budget last year was that instead of spending this $2 billion over 10 years, they said they revised that to the same amount of money being spent over 15 years, which cuts the amount spent per year from $200 million to $133 million over the life of the fund. Another statement in the letter is that Australia is on track to get about a third of our electricity needs to be met by renewables in the early 2020, and that we have an unprecedented wave of clean energy investment in Australia. Well, in fact, this is actually a mostly true statement. We did get to be over 20% renewables last year in 2019, and we will hit the 2020 large-scale renewables target ahead of schedule. Renewables investment, as shown here in both wind and solar mainly, has been increasing, but there is concern that without the effective government policies at the federal level, this investment could taper off. We have had in place a thing called a renewable energy target. This originally was to get 41,000 gigawatt hours of renewable energy from large renewable projects by 2020. The Abbott government revised that target downwards to 33,000 gigawatt hours We are the only country in the world that has ever revised down a renewable energy target. Post 2020, post this year, there is no new target. And indeed, when Labor put out a press release before the election, last election, saying that their goal was to have a 45% emissions reduction target and a 50% renewable energy target, the coalition panned that as being of devastating cost. Another statement in the letter is that we have the world's highest uptake of rooftop solar. 1 in 5 homes have solar on their roofs. This is actually correct. Individual households and businesses have been investing in small-scale solar. We have one of the biggest penetrations of solar PV on rooftops at small scale in the world. However, this has been not due to government policy, but rather due to individual decisions by businesses and households. Another statement is that to support the transition to renewable energy, the government is investing in energy storage and infrastructure of the future, including 1.38 billion in the Snowy 2.0 project. How is that going? Well, yes, the government is investing in this. However, Snowy Hydro 2.0 was announced by Malcolm Turnbull very suddenly. There was no market assessment, there was no cost-benefit analysis, nor was there a feasibility study, and there was no comparison of alternatives. The cost and the time to execution has been blown out from an original 2 billion to closer to 10 billion. And instead of being commissioned in 2021, it won't now be finished at the earliest till 2027. It's also the case that expert analysis of the scheme has shown that the capacity of 350 gigawatt hours put forward in the Turnbull announcement is impossible physically to achieve, and at the best it can only generate 170 gigawatt hours. Another statement, our resources to support the transition to lower emissions will include being the largest exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas. That is also a true statement. We are one of the world's largest exporters of LNG. The question is it a good idea, and is it a pathway to lower emissions? The letter also points to the release of the Technology Investment Roadmap, setting out a guide to future investment in low emissions technologies. Of course, the technology roadmap has led to much commentary, as has this notion that we need a gas-led recovery. So let me just unpack the pluses and minuses of gas. So when burnt, gas creates about 40 to 50% less CO2 than coal for the same amount of energy. So that would seem like a plus. But on the minus side, natural gas is mostly made of methane, which is a far more effective greenhouse gas in terms of heat trapping ability than CO2. Over a 20-year period, it's 80 times more effective. We also get what's called fugitive emissions from gas mining, which is the direct release of methane to the atmosphere during the mining process. And methane in the atmosphere is going up. If we have a look, for example, at the most efficient coal-fired generator in the Australian electricity market, which is at Cogan Creek in Queensland, it emits 831 kilos of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. The mean emissions from the average gas-fired power station is 820 kilograms. So it's only a 1.3% improvement on the most efficient coal-fired power station. If we look at our dirtiest power stations of both gas and coal, the dirtiest gas one is in Dry Creek in South Australia, emits 1,342 kilograms per megawatt hour. The dirtiest coal-fired power station at Yallourn emits 1,316. So by direct comparison, producing electricity from gas and producing electricity from coal is very, very little different. On top of that, fugitive emissions are going up. That's the blue line in this graph, because we are just doing more fracking. Another statement, the Australian government has already committed over 500 million towards a hydrogen future. That is a true statement, but the low emissions technology statement in the technology investment roadmap says that we need to do this, at least in the first little while, by using fossil fuels to produce hydrogen. So hydrogen can be a clean fuel, but not if you split water using fossil fuels. Nearly there. Looking ahead, we are developing a national electric vehicle strategy. Well, in fact, they might be developing one, but they haven't developed one yet. And in fact, when Labor put forward a very well-developed electric vehicle strategy before the last election, it was attacked by the Prime Minister as wanting to destroy our weekends. And in fact, one of the coalition ministers said that Labor wanted to take our utes away. Once again, though, just as in solar PV, people are taking things into their own hands, with electric sales of vehicles, electric vehicle sales rather tripling in Australia over the last few years, with people actually buying electric vehicles. That tripling is coming from a very low base compared to places like Europe, but we are on a trajectory towards higher uptake of electric vehicles. There was nothing in the last federal budget to support electric vehicle infrastructure, but a lot of money being spent on roads. So in summary then, here's the report card as I see it on the letter that you received from the Prime Minister's office. Australia is not taking strong overall action internationally. We are not overachieving on our Kyoto targets. We are not on track to achieve our 2030 Paris target. Our Paris target is not responsible. It's one of the weakest in the world. There is funding for climate action. The question is how that is being spent, because so far it's not achieving effective emissions reduction. There is no renewable support from the government. However, people are taking things into their own hands anyway. Storage, such as snowy hydro, has a lot of question marks over how effective it will be for the money that is being spent. And gas as a clean transition fuel simply doesn't stack up. My personal assessment of the report card, if I got that from one of my students, frankly would be an F-.
Sorry, Lesley, just a 2-minute warning.
Thank you, nearly there. On top of this, and this is nothing to do with the letter, though, well, I guess it's related, Australia has now joined the US, China and Russia in refusing to sign the latest international pledge on biodiversity. The pledge has been signed, this came out just a couple of weeks ago, it's been signed by over 70 other world leaders. It includes a commitment to net zero by 2050, which is the sticking point for Australia. I want to emphasise that what Australia does really, really matters, and that's because we need to leave 90% of all coal reserves in the ground unburnt to have any chance of meeting the below 2-degree Paris target. Australia is the largest exporter of coal. It's the second largest exporter of thermal coal and the third largest exporter of fossil fuels overall. But there are some bright spots, and they include coming from some politicians. I think, as Liz mentioned, Japan announced a net zero target by 2050. Here in New South Wales, the Energy and Environment Minister, Matt Keane, has been a fantastic advocate of renewables and of climate action in general. He is in a coalition government, so it's great to see that some coalition politicians are really doing great things. And once again, Australians businesses are really investing and doing the right thing, as are households. So this is in spite of the government, not because of it. Finally, I'll just leave you with a plug for the Climate Council and some of the resources provided on the Climate Council website, including lots of myth-busting reports. Some of the links are shown there. And they will give you a lot more information about some of the issues that I've just covered. We also have a climate action toolkit for personal action, And because a lot of you do have opportunities to talk to your customers and other people in your communities, we do have a communications guide to help you all talk about climate change. So I hope we have time for some questions. My apologies for getting through it rather quickly, but hopefully this gives you a bit of a flavour. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Lesley. That was amazing. Yeah, the report card F-, that's a bit of a worry, isn't it? I think everyone here is pretty concerned. If we haven't been to date, I think after that we probably are. It does seem overwhelming at times, but I think Vets for Climate Action would just like to encourage you to say that vets are, a trusted member of the community, and I think we have a role to step up now and say we don't think this is where we want to be. We want to stop that level of warming. We want to be somewhere where we were perhaps 50 years ago if we can, and try and protect the animals that we've come to work with and love and need. So really, I'd just like to bring it back to some of the sort of things that we think we can do. And firstly, before I do that, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll endeavour to get them answered for you. If not today, then by email at a later date. But thank you so much, Mark and Lesley. Those slides were really, really compelling. So just in terms of personally what I think you can do, and I'm going to have my just 2 minutes say, and then I'm going to ask Jeanette to speak briefly. After that, we've got a short poll we'd like to do for you, which is just to explain where you'd like to see further seminars heading, what sort of topics you'd like us to cover. So if you could stick around for that, that'd be great. We're going to have a photo as well, and afterwards, if you want to stay around to chat more, that'd be great, and we can chat with our voices instead of on the chat. So in my mind, at least, some of the things you can do, you can certainly join Vets for Climate Action. We really need more members. We've just started out in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, so we're looking for as many members as we can. And further to that, if you feel like volunteering, we have a number of committees that are working in all different areas at the moment. Some examples would be the rural group, who are looking specifically at livestock, and also, reaching out to vets in rural areas and reaching out to, say, politicians in those areas as well, and media. We have a social media group. We have a group that works specifically with professional affiliations like the AVA and the universities and industry. We've also got a big event coming up with the zoos, which will be a vigil on the wildlife that were killed in the fires. So there's various committees that you can join and get involved with. So we really strongly encourage you to do that. The other thing you can do in terms of individual emissions, I think probably the time has passed where that's going to make a big difference now. But if you go and visit your MP, or at least call your MP, that does make a big difference. Emailing has no effect, so just don't even bother. We've spoken to people who work in those areas, and it really has no impact. But if you actually turn up and talk to your MP, that does carry some weight. Obviously, talk to your friends and colleagues and your clients if you can. There's plenty of resources out there. We'll have this talk and the slides on our website if you need graphs, and also the Climate Council, as Lesley said, is a good resource. The other thing you can do is change your investments and your superannuation to sustainable and renewable sources. That's always a useful thing. And just get involved. And we really want to try and change the conversation. So, we're headed in the wrong direction. Australia is not leading the charge, and we'd like to change that. So I'd just like to call on Jeanette Kessels, who is the chair of VFCA, just to say a brief few words, and then we'll do the poll and then have our photo. But thank you all very much for joining us. It's been great. Unmute, Jeanette.
Thank you, Mark and Lesley, very much for helping us to understand. It's only when we have the moment and we really know what's going on that we are compelled to act. I'd like to say thanks to Anne and Liz and Leah and Ben for putting this seminar together. There will be more, and they will be excellent. You might have seen the climate clock in New York. Look that up. It's quite a powerful piece of art that is sort of giving us a feeling of how much time we have left. I have 10 years to devote to this, I think, and I've spent one already. Every man, woman, child, family, business, sector, corporation, government and nation needs to reduce their emissions. We need to do it by 7% 0.2% every year for the next 10 years. So all of us, all of our businesses, all of our sectors need to do that. We need to take responsibility. It is urgent and we need to work together. So we'd love you to join Veterinarians for Climate Action, whether or not you're a veterinarian, and contribute your time, your connections, your influence, your intellect, your energy, or your dollars. Whatever you have to offer, we will appreciate it and enjoy your company. So thank you. Please stay on Zoom afterwards if you have some time and you'd like to chat further, or if you'd like one of our volunteers to give you a call and see how you might be able to contribute, please send us an email on our website. So thank you. Thank you very much.